we're going to get started. It would be lovely if any eager viewers wanted to move up to the front row, which is empty. No takers? Please feel free to move up because we might have some latecomers coming in who might need to squeeze in the back. But I'll let you do that in your own time. Welcome everyone. My name's Louise Sims. I'm one of the Prevention of Violence Against Women specialists at DBRC. I particularly want to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's cultural heritage and their continuing connection to land, leaders and community across Victoria and across Australia. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal people with us today. Thank you all for coming along to the 4th Respectful Relationships in Victoria seminar. It's really great to see a lot of familiar faces out there as well as a lot of new people. I think this topic is one that we haven't, early childhood is something that we haven't had a lot of events around, so it's great to see some new faces and I hope to meet all of you over lunch after the great panel discussion. On the agenda this morning, so I'll give you a quick update on what we've been doing in PIP and sort of what's happening in respectful relationships around Victoria at the moment, and then we'll get into a panel discussion about the challenges and opportunities of doing this work in the early childhood context, which my colleague Emma Hardley will be moderating. Before that, I have a little bit of housekeeping. So toilets, a few of you have found already, they're kind of tricky from here. You have to go back down to the ground floor and into the main building. There's escalators in there, turn right past them and then you'll see signs for the toilets. They're next to an area called the Job Shop and they're a bit easier to find than it sounds. Filming, you will have noticed there's a few cameras around today. For those of you who've been to our seminars before, you know that we film these events and we will make that video, the video of this event available online in the next few weeks for people who couldn't join us today. We are also doing a bit of filming today for a broader video about PIP. So if anyone's not comfortable being filmed, please don't let that stop you asking a question. Just let us know afterwards and we'll make sure that you don't appear in the video. And similarly for during lunch and networking, we will have cameras around, but just let us know if you're not comfortable and we'll make sure you don't end up in the video. Don't let it stop you from interacting, please. And I'd also just really like to thank RMIT again for their generous use of this space. We have a really great partnership with RMIT, which means they give us a venue for all of our PIP events, which we are really grateful for. So, a bit of an update about what's happening in respectful relationships at the moment. Some of you know that I've actually been on leave for a few weeks, so I wasn't really across what's been happening in the last little while. Luckily, I've had some helpful colleagues give me this update. So Monash University has been engaged to develop and deliver the professional learning for up to 4,000 early childhood educators from funded kindergarten programs across Victoria. This will include a 2-hour online module and a full-day face-to-face workshop. The Department of Education and Training and Monash are currently working on the design and implementation of this, and they'll communicate workshop dates and venues, or the department will communicate workshop dates and venues once the content has been finalised. Expressions of interest for this, I believe, is still open. So contact the department's central office, or you can search on their website and there should be information on how to express interest in doing that professional learning. And evaluation of the statewide Respectful Relationships rollout is now underway. Surveys went out at the end of term 1 to community organisations who've been involved, and secondary school students and primary and secondary school teachers will be surveyed over the next few weeks. In terms of the Partners in Prevention program, we have quite a bit going on as usual. Many of you will know that next month we're hosting our first Prevention of Violence Against Women conference here at RMIT. The conference is called Achieving Generational Change. It's a 1-day conference and it will look at, basically look at the first 18 months of the statewide rollout of respectful relationships and what learnings we can take from that rollout to inform the scale up and mainstreaming of prevention initiatives in other settings. There's a special discounted price for PIP members, so if you haven't registered yet, it's almost sold out, so I would recommend getting online and registering as soon as possible. We have another session of our Respectful Relationships Whole School Approach training scheduled next month in the CBD. I think it's the 11th of May, but I didn't actually include that. It will be on our website though. This training is really useful for anyone who wants to better understand how schools work and how the community sector can support schools to implement an evidence-based whole school approach to respectful relationships education. This training is also available to book as tailored training within an organisation or in a particular area. So if that's something you're interested in, just get in touch with us and we can help you with that. And we have now wrapped up our 2 pilot communities of practice for Partners in Prevention. Each of those groups met 5 times over the last 6 months, which was a really fun and exciting process for us. We're really looking forward to looking at how we can expand that model and reach more PIP members over the next year. So we'll keep everyone posted about that through our bulletins over the next few months. And finally, we know that many of you are doing this work essentially on your own within your organisations. And we also know how helpful it can be to just bounce ideas and work through problems and chat to colleagues. So if you don't have those colleagues, or even if you do, Emma and I are here for PIP members to have those conversations and to help work through difficult issues, bounce ideas, make suggestions, offer advice. So you can call us or email us anytime. If you don't have our contact details, they're on the website and all of our email bulletins, or you can come and find Emma or I after today's talk. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Emma to introduce our panel. Thanks.
Thanks, Louise. And yes, welcome from me as well to everyone that's here and the people that are live streaming. We're here, as Louise said, to talk today about early childhood settings and respectful relationships and bringing those together. We know that the early years are a really critical time in which gender roles and stereotype constructions of masculinity and femininity are formed. It's also a time when they can be challenged and alternatives to the binary understanding or gendered experience can be explored. And we know that respectful relationships education, of course, is really crucial in enabling this to happen. I'm going to introduce our panellists in a moment, and I've got some questions prepared for them. There will be time towards the end, though, for questions from the floor, so we'll open up for audience Q&A. And if you are live streaming and you do have a question, you'll see a comments box just beside the video that you're currently watching. If you're able to just pop your question in there, Louise will read some of those out for the panel when we get to the audience Q&A. So let's meet our panellists. On my left here we have Mulayli Colley. Mulayli is the Senior Advisor for Parenting and Early Years at Our Watch, the National Foundation for Prevention of Violence Against Women and Their Children. Mulayli's career began in early childhood education and care and has more recently focused on transformative professional development, translating research into practice and working collaboratively with practitioners to apply research and evidence to practice. Mulayli has worked across the health and community service sectors, facilitating participatory networks, designing ongoing participatory professional development programs, policy advice, and conducting research. Welcome, Mulayli. Next we have Rachel Bai. Rachel has more than 20 years experience in the education sector, ranging from sexuality education in high schools to primary and early childhood learning in New Zealand, Australia and the UK. She's found her calling in the formative years, working as a kindergarten teacher and educational leader with a particular interest in gender, power and equity in the classroom. Her most current role, though, is parenting a fresh little human named Eddie. Sophie Gail is the City Issues Project Officer and Project Lead for the Building Children's Resilience Through Respectful and Equitable Relationships pilot project at the City of Melbourne. Sophie has worked in local government in Victoria since 2004, focusing on preventing violence against women, promoting gender equity and health promotion. She holds a Master's in Women's Health from the University of Melbourne. And prior to moving into local government, Sophie was a youth worker focusing particularly on programs to support young women. Welcome, Sophie. And Tennille Summers is the Preventing Violence Against Women Officer at Darebin City Council. She's worked to address men's violence against women and improve gender equity for the past 9 years. Before working in local government, Tennille worked for a women's health service in regional Victoria. She has a background in public health, politics and policy, including a master's degree, which she hasn't included in here, but I happen to know, so I'm just letting you all know. She's a self-confessed bookworm and loves rummaging through markets and collecting old things. Welcome to Neil. So to kick us off today, I really want to start quite broad and I guess get to know a little bit about each of you and how it is that you came to work or be interested in the realm of early childhood. And specifically early childhood with a focus on respectful relationships education. Tennille, we might start with you if that's okay. Oh yes, microphones.
How's that? Yes, okay. So in my role at Darebin City Council, I've been involved in PIP since probably about 2011 or 12. So I had started, I guess, with respectful relationships and thinking about the high school years and years 9 and 10, but then kind of found an opportunity with the services and programs that council deliver to think about the early years setting, particularly around the different programs and services for the early years that council deliver. So I think it grew from probably having some time working in the respectful relationship space in high school years. Yeah.
Great, thanks Tennille. Sophie.
Thanks very much. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Thanks for having us here, Emma. So I think really a lot of the reason why I was able to do this pilot was through opportunity. So at council at the time we had a Preventing Violence Against Women strategy, and we also had a community safety strategy which had a focus on prevention. So it was really against that background that we could bring this in. We had some very early discussions with Dr. Kylie Smith from University of Melbourne, who was really keen to extend her own knowledge and vast experience, but she needed a centre really to work in. And as a council, we manage several children's services, childcare services, children's centres as they're called. So it was really an opportunity for myself in the branch that I'm in to work with community services branch, which manages the children's services, and bring all these sort of facets together. And often there's a moment in time when you can do these things and you have to grab it because you never know when that opportunity is going to come up again.
That's right, and we're going to hear a lot more about the work that Sophie's been doing with council later on. Sure.
Hi, I sort of fell into early childhood education accidentally, so I started out working for family planning in New Zealand, teaching sexuality education in high schools. So I thought that was a great direction to head in, but then I ended up doing a degree in primary school, working with the older age kids, so the kids that were going through puberty and the challenges that came with that, which I found interesting. And towards the end of that, I ended up accidentally having a job teaching prep, which I bucked up against and said I didn't want to do, but I found my calling. So what I really love about working with young children is that, especially in the early years, is that they apart from this one issue of gender, they are generally unbound by the peer pressures that the older children have really been squashed down by. So there's a lot more creativity and curiosity, and they're really a lot freer to express themselves. So working with those children is really dynamic, it's really creative, and every day is quite different. So that's one of the things that I really like about it. But also the learning's really tangible. So every day you can see someone change, and you can see the penny drop for them on so many different areas, not just educational or curriculum things, but just in how they view themselves or their identity. So it's really satisfying. And the gender aspect has come through because I've been quite horrified that even though they're so open-minded about so many things, gender stereotypes and how they view themselves as very rigid from a very young age. 2-3-year-olds will start policing each other and policing themselves about what they can and can't do. So it's interest.
Thanks, Rachel. And Malali?
Yeah, hi everyone. Look, my background is early childhood education and care. That's what I went into study straight after high school, all those many years ago. During my time there, I guess I worked on many social justice issues in early childhood education and care, both in practice and community, and was very interested in the place of early childhood education and care in a community, and how it could be a place of resource, but also a place that brings community together in a lot of ways. I then continued on, as you heard, to do some work in policy and research and transformational professional development in both early child education and care and across the health and community services workforce more broadly. And an opportunity came up to work at Our Watch in a early years and parenting role, which I applied for and moved down here to Melbourne for from Queensland, which is where most of my career has happened to date. I guess I was saying to Rachel earlier, it's always been something on the radar. I remember in my very early years of working in early child education and care, I was working in a room with 15 months to 2.5-year-olds, and we had a new educator come in who happened to be male, and I noticed how he played differently to the children, to the way I was playing. Early child education and care theory has a strong grounding in critically reflective practice and a strong grounding in equity and children's rights. And I think it was those sorts of theories and learning from my degree in practice that I went, oh, that person, I can play, why can't I play like that as well? So it's something that has, you know, I can still picture that moment, I can still picture the child, I can still picture the yellow aeroplane. And so that has probably, you know, led me to where I am today, going, well, why can't we play in different ways and be in different ways in these settings with children? I guess my role at Our Watch is not actually in respectful relationships in early childhood. It's a bit of a broader role, and we specifically started looking at parenting because of some research that we've done. But today in the conversations I'll be drawing on and sitting here as both an early childhood professional and as somebody in an early years and parenting role at Our Watch.
Great, thank you. I guess what's really come... Yeah, I'm going to... Thank you. I'm actually going to get all the mics on in a minute and make sure that they're working. It's what really comes through in all of the comments that we've just had that stands out to me is the learning that comes from actually doing the work, which seems like an obvious thing to say, but we have, you know, we can read a book, we can do research, and until we actually engage in the work, either as an early child educator or in partnering with early childhood services as a community practitioner, that's where the real learning and transformation, I think, for us individually and collectively can happen. I am just going to briefly pause to make sure that each of the microphones are working. That one seems to be, and if you just hold them up and tilt them slightly, it tends to catch
like
the...
This?
Yeah, like you're singing.
Oh, this one is.
And if you're ready to share, that's great. Okay. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. And if it is difficult to hear in the room, it'll be difficult to hear online and capturing on the film as well. So please do let us know if it's not working for you. All right, Malali, we're going to ask you a question now about your role at Our Watch. And in that role, you've been leading a public campaign directed largely at parents and young people, or young children, sorry, that you mentioned in your introduction, the Because Why or Power of Parenting campaign. So I'm just wondering if you can please share with us the vision, purpose and the evidence, I guess, that sits behind this campaign, and a reflection on how it might be relevant to early childhood educators in the centres they work in.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think Our Watch conducted a survey that basically, and this is where the campaign came from, that you know, it was 92% of parents who agreed that it's important to treat girls and boys the same in the early years. This survey, we had about just over 850 survey responses from around Australia of parents who had a child or children 3 years and under. It also showed us that 79% of the parents surveyed would like to challenge the restrictive gender stereotypes that surround their young children. So we had a bit of a solid ground for parents saying, yeah, I think they're around, I'd like to support it, and actually I might like to challenge it. But other parts of the research sort of said, oh, not sure how to do it, or what does that look like? So I guess the results showed that there is strong support amongst parents who participated for the principle of gender equality, and there was a willingness to take personal practical action to challenge the kinds of gender stereotyping that creates inequality. The research report is available on our website, and we can probably send it out afterwards if you want to have a look more closely at the kinds of questions we asked families. So what we wanted to share with parents through the campaign was how rigid gender stereotypes limit children's opportunities and freedom to make their choices, and what parents can do about it. And the way that rolled out was a social media campaign of a number of short films, a lead films and some other supporting films, and a campaign website that talks about because why, you know, why would we want to do this work, the impact of gender stereotypes on kids, but also provides some information about what families could do, and even some scripts, question and answer scripts that say, well, what do I do when my 3-year-old says this? How do I do that in a way that challenges and doesn't reinforce and provides an opening for a further conversation? So I guess in terms of the way educators can use that information, you know, there's a public website with a whole heap of scripts that even educators could use to both challenge, but also, I guess, take the conversation to the next level, to go beyond, oh, well, pink's everyone's colour, to challenge the hidden messages in some of the ideas that children and adults perpetuate. And educators could use that by sharing it with services, by putting it up in their services, sharing it with parents, putting it up in their services, but also by having a look and seeing if they can get any hints from it as well. It's basically about some tips and hints about how to talk to kids.
Fantastic. The name of the campaign, Because Why, I love, because small children often will say, why, because why is that? And especially when they get into that question asking phase. I have a friend who's got a 3-year-old at the moment, and she's asking lots of questions, and my friend said that for about 90% of the questions that she asks, she feels like saying, because of the patriarchy. And of course, that is not useful for a 3-year-old. But it gave me a chuckle. Sophie, I wanted to come to you now in your work at the City of Melbourne, and the work you've been doing focusing on building children's resilience through respectful, equitable relationships. Can you tell us about the project and you know what was involved in setting it up, and where it's at currently, and anything you sort of learnt along the way that you think might be useful for community practitioners in thinking about partnering with early learning centres?
You might need to remind me of that last bit at the end.
I can do that. There's 3 questions in one there, Sophie.
What's that?
3 questions in one there.
Isn't it 4? And I'm really sorry, but I've got a sort of cold thing, so if I sound croaky, it's because I am. Okay, so we ran this project as a pilot project at the end of 2007, so last year. It took about 18 months before we actually ran it as a program of work to set it up. So just briefly, once we decided that we needed to get into this work, we did some work actually with Sharon Simon, who was in your position, I think, Emma, at DBRCV.
That's right.
We came on board. And she'd also done some work, as I mentioned, with Kylie Smith before, who you may know is a real expert in this area. So it was really from that kind of evidence base and that platform and that desire to come together and take that opportunity. what we did was we commissioned a literature review, and that was from Australian National University Centre for Social Research Methods. The literature review in the first instance was charged to find out about other programs of a similar nature that had occurred. What they actually found was that although there were things that had happened, and particularly in Victoria, not many of them had been properly evaluated or researched or peer reviewed. And so, it was quite hard to find information. So what they did instead really was they looked at the development of gender and gender identity, particularly around, masculinity and femininity and power between the genders at that early childhood level up to the age of 5. So that was really fascinating because it generated some very good recommendations about how we might want to go ahead and do this work. So we also set up a project advisory committee with some external expertise and internal expertise as well. We, as I mentioned before, we run various children's centres, so we needed to select one of our children's centres to do the pilot in. Now, I'm sort of jumping about a bit here, but in retrospect, I think the better way of doing it, or was not the way that we did it, which was for the management to select the centre, but for an expression of interest to go out to the centres, because I think one of the most important things you do in this work is you work with the centre that is that wants to, and that is the most ready to. It's one of our key learnings, I think. The centre that we actually ran this in went through the most unbelievable organisational change. I think there were 4 acting coordinators in the space of 7 months. It's just what happened, and you often can't predict that, and there were all sorts of reasons for that. But I'm sure everybody sitting here who's worked in the space, and probably a lot of you sitting here as well, would think, wow, with that level of leadership change, it's extremely difficult to do this kind of work because you have to have the leadership totally on board, understanding. And as a project manager, I had to kind of keep going, explaining what we were doing time and time again. So, it was incredibly complex. It's an incredibly complex environment, and it's particularly complex when you're talking about someone like a local government that manages services, because you've got all kinds of different layers of management, which you may not have if you're working in your area, Rachel, which is one centre. Yeah, it's a totally different kettle of fish. Not to say that we shouldn't do it, but it's just really complex. Now you're going to have to put me back on track again.
Sure, yep, no, that's fantastic. And I love that you've drawn on the readiness and the need for leadership buy-in, because that will resonate, I think, with people in the room today and watching online in terms of the work that they have already done or might be doing with primary schools and secondary schools in this space, that having principal buy-in and leadership buy-in at primary and secondary school level, we know is absolutely crucial, and that's a key part of the whole school approach when talking about primary and secondary. So while there are many differences and nuances when it comes to the early childhood setting, there are these key similarities that we can really kind of draw on when talking about early childhood. I think actually, Sophie, you've covered most of the question, and I want to, I guess, ask something else now, which is what are the next steps for the project, and if it could be scaled up, or can you imagine it being scaled up, potentially to apply to other children's centres in the City of Melbourne and indeed beyond the City of Melbourne, potentially across Victoria? And I'm particularly wondering about the notion of a whole of setting approach, and if that's something that you have looked at.
Yes, so as you mentioned, Emma, we attempted to run a pilot in a whole of setting, with a whole of setting approach. We were partially successful with that. In the end, what happened was that we were actually only able to run the pilot for about 5 months, and we had wanted to run it for 6 months. And the reason for that is the way that council budgets run, which is through a financial year, and the way that a school year runs, which is obviously a calendar year. So that was like, cut in half was part of it. The other reason was because we worked with 2 universities. We worked with the University of Melbourne in the development of the program, and we worked with Victoria University on the formal evaluation of the pilot. They needed to get ethics approval. That took a really, really long time. And we couldn't do anything, we couldn't start anything for a really long time. Anyway, so in one of the major learnings from this, and this does feed into what you're asking me, is that you just need lots and lots of time. If you think about what we're trying to do here, we're trying to create cultural change. What we were trying to do is we were trying to very ambitiously, over-ambitiously, create cultural change for the educators. And we were, with the children as well, to an extent, by having discussions rather than shutting down discussions. It was more around opening up discussions. And then clearly the parents have got a very key role to play in that. And what you really need to do, and what was recommended, I suppose, as a gold standard through our evaluation process, is you need a staged socialisation process. And I think this is some of the lessons that can be learnt for the sector, I hope. Victoria University came up with this really great idea around a gender pedagogue. So that is somebody, and apparently they do this in Scandinavian countries. They seem to do everything fabulously there, so perhaps we should all just go there for a visit. So the idea of the gender pedagogue, obviously, is somebody who has expertise around gender. And what they could potentially do is go into all the centres and provide that mentorship, leadership, time and expertise to the people who are working within the sector. Now, that takes a lot of money. It's not something that we can do as a council. But hey, wouldn't it be great if Department of Education and Training picked up on that? And, funded some key positions, who could do that and who could actually support early childhood services to have that expertise and have that mentoring. One of the most important things that came out, apart from time, the time factor and the rate of cultural change and how long you need to, do that to expect it, was about the benefit of mentoring. So in our program, we did do mentoring of educators. They reported that was the most significant thing that got them interested. And part of the reason for that is because what you have to understand is that all the educators are starting from a very, very different point when they're coming into this. And that's because of the training. You've got people who are Cert 3 trained up to degree or a master's degree, or even a PhD probably. You've also got people's interest in the topic, that's really important, and their various degrees of interest, it has to be said. And their belief system as well, because we are dealing with something that's that could be quite controversial, unfortunately, but it is. Now again, mentoring is a hard thing to do one-on-one with educators from a practical and operational perspective. However, there are ways that it can be done, and what we're proposing in our next budget is a system whereby you send an EOI out and to all the centres and get some centre champions. So they are people who, within that service, are really fired up about this issue, want to learn more, want to have those discussions with their peers, the room leaders, the other educators. So we're hoping to do some kind of train the trainer kind of module where we can skill those people up, and then they can work within the operational bounds of their own centre, which they know better than anybody else. And that's really our kind of first step of it. I think that would be great if Department of Education, or even broader federal government, if they're interested, could know about, because these are things that really could be taken up as a principle. Yeah.
Love the idea of a gender pedagogue. Anyone who's looking for a title change, there's one for you. Thank you, Sophie. Rachel, I want to come to you now, and you take a feminist approach and apply a gender lens to your work as a kindergarten teacher and educational leader. What are the challenges and opportunities, the benefits even, of approaching your work with children and their families, and your colleagues, I guess, in this way?
well, we all know that children are growing up now in a very gendered society. So you only have to walk down the aisle of a shop that sells clothes or toys to see that things are really specifically targeted at either gender. And that's changing a little bit now, but generally still, if you walked into Kmart or Target or any place like that, you will see that the messages that kids are seeing when they're walking down those aisles are really clear. The toys that are marketed at them obviously reflect more broadly on society's value of gender. So the toys for boys, the toys that boys think that they should be playing with are the ones that support the traits that are valued by society for men. So it's things that are active, things that are loud, things that involve superhero or rescue or being the boss and leading. And then on the other side of the aisle, on the pink side of the aisle, are the unicorns and the rainbows and the kitties and the pink tea sets. So kids, when they come to a service, they're already saturated heavily with ideas about what they should be and what society thinks they should be. And then in their families, the same sort of things apply. So mum might or might not be the main caregiver who does more of the housework, or dad might take the sons on camping trips, and little girls might be going to day spas with mum. So when they arrive at a service, they're already pretty entrenched with what they already think about gender. So when you apply the gender lens to early childhood, you've got to take on board already what they're coming with. And when they start to play, if you aren't working towards breaking down those stereotypes, you will find pretty quickly that the boys will fall into the gender role of superheroes, block play, Lego. And the way that they use the space is different. So they tend to dominate the space if you let them. They will be louder, they physically take up more space. And the girls will often retreat from that. They'll retreat back into sort of safer places because that's the way that they've been brought up. Once you start to look at things through a gender lens, you realise that you can't really just leave it. You can't just really let it sit. And you start to have conversations with the children, and you start to work towards challenging those stereotypes. And it comes up organically. So it can be a child starting a conversation, but there's ways also to facilitate that. So an example of that might be we often have different role play areas set up, and it's usually based around children's interests, things that come up over time. So one of the ones that's really common is setting up a fire station area. And the way that I start is to sit down and do a brainstorm with the children with a big piece of paper, all about everything they know about fire stations and firefighters. And one of the first things that you'll hear is one of the children will say, firemen. And so that's immediately a discussion that you can have. Why do you think that men only are firefighters? And I've been lucky that a few years ago I had a parent who was a firefighter, so a mum, so I had her come in and talk to the kids. So we can use the resources around us if you're lucky to have someone like that. And in that role play area, just from the discussion, we're talking about who can do it, who can't, why can't a female be a firefighter? And you will be challenged. There will be someone there will be a boy that will say, oh, because you're weak. Because they're too weak, they can't carry the hose. And you challenge them back and you'll say, well, why can't you carry a hose? I'm pretty sure I can carry a hose. Shall we see if I can carry a hose? And pick up something heavy, and they're like, oh, okay. And you start to see the penny drop. So instead of just letting the assumptions lie, it's challenging them. But also, once you start doing that, they start to challenge themselves, and you'll find that the power dynamics will start to change, and that fire station area will be a safe place for girls to play. And if it's starting to not be, you can step in and intervene, or you'll often see that they'll actually start to police themselves in a good way.
I really love the analogy of thinking about applying a gender lens like flicking on a light switch, and once that switch is on, and that's essentially what you're sort of talking about in terms of your children, and the earlier that switch is flicked, the better, I guess, because once it's on, you can't ever turn it off. And it's almost like there's a little dimmer that, light dimmer that just keeps getting brighter and brighter. And so the earlier, obviously, that this work begins with children, that's where I guess we'll see generational change and cultural change coming up through the generations. It's such essential work. Tennille, you, similarly to Sophie, but also on quite a different project, you led an early childhood gender equity project at Darebin City Council called Creating Gender Equity in the Early Years. Can you tell us a bit about the project and the resource development involved in that project?
Sure. So we, as Emma just said, we've created a resource predominantly for local government, but looks at how a whole range of organisations, including early years centres or services, could look at their setting or their centre, so whether they're a kindergarten, an early years centre, a library, a children's hub, to think about ways in which they can apply a gender lens to early years and early childhood education. And so quite different, I guess, and important to acknowledge is that unlike Melbourne City Council, Darebin doesn't run or manage any of its early years centres, so it's quite a different relationship with early years educators and centres. So, but then I guess unlike other councils across Victoria, we have some programs and services that other councils may not. So things like an early years resource van, a preschool field officer, which I guess what I'm trying to say is that the one size that doesn't fit all, as that's been discussed, is really clear in the early years, that the early years can look quite different as opposed to maybe respectful relationships in a primary school or a high school setting. But I guess the purpose of the project was to think about the kinds of resources that might support early years educators like Rachel to build on the work that they're already doing. So we realised that early years educators have a great wealth of skill and knowledge in early years as well as gender and challenging gender stereotypes. So the resource looks at, I guess, 5 different sections of the early years to think about providing resources and tools to help, whether you are a community worker, a local government preschool field officer, a children's services, or a childcare waitlist, of whatever your role is in the early years, I guess, to help shape maybe some more of challenging more of the structural inequalities that gender, or the structural gender inequalities, in the early years. So like I said, there's 5 sections, and we also worked with Dr. Kylie Smith, who is really very wonderful, to think about, I guess, the frameworks of gender in the context of the Preventing Violence Against Women framework, so our Watch drivers of violence, as well as the early years frameworks in Victoria and Australia, to look at how they cross over and the opportunities to work together with them. So providing that context of the early years as a key setting for challenging gender stereotypes, but also providing more equitable environments for children to learn and develop. There's also key resources that sit throughout the tool. I guess it's like a toolkit. But they look at, I guess the key 2 areas are if you would like to assess a space, so whether it be the library or the book list at a childcare centre, or the physical space and the environment, so to assess it with a gender lens, whether you'd like to get support to develop a gender equity policy for early years centre, for kindergarten, or I guess they're the key ones that it looks at. It also provides some support for thinking about how councils can provide better gender equitable services and programs. So, as we were saying before, like some of the programs that we might run, and this is maybe more reflected around respectful relationships in high school and primary school, providing support for schools around some of the support with the curriculum or the rollout of respectful relationships. We also, as a local government, need to ensure that our services are gender equitable. So if we are thinking about the services like immunisation, that we also think about the language that the immunisation team use with families. So I guess applying that gender lens to our own work as well. and continuing to challenge our own work so that there's consistent messaging, because I think that's something that Rachel said very clearly, is that children and families can come with really rigid I guess beliefs around gender and beliefs around a whole range of things, like we all do, and they're really shaped by what we see around us. So if we are hearing positive gender norms in our early years centre, that's really excellent. But when we leave and go to the, I don't know, the immunisation service, and then someone says, look at you, you sweet little girl in that cute dress, like it completely undermines the efforts of people like Rachel and really wonderful early years educators. So I guess it's thinking about that, creating those consistent environments that do challenge gender inequity. Sorry, don't want to challenge that. And then also, I guess also it's been mentioned around the critical reflection framework that is really core in the theory of around early years. So there's also a resource within the toolkit that looks at using critical reflective questions. So throughout the toolkit as well, it provides some questions so that people who are using the toolkit can critically reflect, you know, how do I speak with young people? How do I think about these things? You know, and continuing to help us realise that we all need to be challenged in how we see or view the world, and how we then place that on other people, and whether that's limiting how children view the world. That's
fantastic. And the resource really is worth, or the resources, the package, if you like, really is worth delving into as a community sector practitioner. So we might be able to provide links.
One more,
please.
Yeah. So each of the sections of the resource have a supporting video, which are really valuable, and Rachel's a star of one of them. So there's 5 videos, and they really provide a lot of the context that help, I guess, to better understand what is the purpose of the assessment tools, but also gives you really great hints around, so there's key different people like Dr. Kylie Smith, we have 2 early years educators, we have, say, the maternal and child health coordinator from council, the early years resource fan worker, just to, I guess, share little pieces of information about how, they're not about how to use the toolkit, it's about how to practically think about it in your work.
Fantastic, and that's really what all of you, PIP members often want and are seeking, is that practice examples and the really concrete kind of tangible examples of how you can bring this information into your practice. Thanks, Tennille. Yeah, we can make the links and information to those resources available to you later on. Tennille just mentioned in her response the National Framework for Preventing Violence Against Women, Change the Story. And Malali, I want to come to you now and focus in on that a little bit. In early childhood theory and practice, there is talk about equality, equity and social justice, with some mention of gender equality, as well as challenges to rigid gender roles and stereotypes, which we know is one of the drivers of violence against women. I'm wondering about the other drivers of violence against women, and whether there are ways that early childhood settings can, or in fact do, seek to challenge those other drivers as workplaces. And I'm thinking specifically, I guess, about violence condoning attitudes as a driver, if you'd like to focus on that, but really any of the drivers you'd like to draw on would be great.
Sure, I guess this in some ways takes a conversation away from the practice of practitioners into what is the context that early childhood education and care settings are operating in. That context is a female workforce. Over 90% of people working in early child education and care are women. Our workforce that is paid at a very low rate, where and with the perception that the work isn't highly valued. We know this from workforce research, and also from the campaigns that are happening at the moment and have been happening over a number of years for pay equity in this area. I guess I just want to say that because it is a little bit of a slightly different conversation. And so when we're talking about all of the drivers, I think some of the things we would be talking about are whole of organisation approaches to workplace equality and respect, looking at both the policies and the practices internal and external and how organisations work. An example of that, particularly around condoning violence, would be how early childhood organisations and early childhood peak bodies, whether they be peak bodies for private for-profit service or not-for-profit, support the development of policies which enable people who identify as victim survivors to access services, to access time away, and sort of say, no, this isn't right, and here are the policies we've got to allow you to take any time that you need. That goes to a couple, and it also goes to the other driver about women's independence. And I think in some ways the wages, and we'll talk about this later, I think, as well, so I won't go too much into it. But look, I think those whole of workplace programs with a focus on workplace rather than how individuals practice would go towards addressing some of those drivers in the setting and possibly enable a movement further up into the structures and systems as well.
Mm. Is there anyone else on the panel that would like to add anything to that? Yes, Sophie, yeah.
I think that's a really good approach. And one of the things I was going to mention reflects what you were talking about, policy just being so important, you know, on various different levels, but particularly within a service. You can't really do a whole of centre approach unless you have an overriding policy that's either adapted or introduced. And that gives you the mandate. It gives you the mandate to do the work, but it also sends a very strong leadership message that this is something that the organisation, be it a local government or, you know, one of the really big providers, are committed to. So, you know, I think that's one of the essential things for a whole of centre approach. In terms of what you're talking about, you know, I think it's really great to bring in all those other things. I think that's probably the way to do it, because it's actually just even focusing on gender stereotypes and rigid gender norms and questioning those, having those discussions with children, putting them into intentional teaching practices. In a way, that's enough. On a practical, operational level, I don't know if you'd agree, Rachel, but a lot of the time, you know, people need to up their skills. This is educators I'm talking about. And they're also trying to run a centre. So they're not just doing this. They're doing all kinds of other things, and then there's a, you know, flu epidemic and the whole centre's cleared out for a week, and then they get inspected, and then, you know, and it's just, and then the centre coordinator changes, and there's a lot of layering of issues. So I think my experience anyway with the project that we run is you can expect too much, and you actually need to sort of focus on what you're doing on this operational level, where the policy stuff at a higher level is going on, but people actually need to see that people are walking the talk as well. And I think that's a whole other thing that we could talk about, because yeah, that's an issue that we all know about, in terms of, you know, what you've just been speaking about in terms of the funding and the view of the workforce, and but yes, I just think that it's one of the things that we found with our educators was that even just understanding key concepts and ideas, there was a vast array of understanding, even at that level. So you've got to really strip it back and start right at the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah. And it sort of raises the question of getting to know the service and the sector, I guess, before kind of, you know, going in gung-ho about what we think might, you know, they might actually need. And Malala, you speak about that as well. Look, seeing as we have sort of gone into this more theoretical space, we'll just hover here for a little bit longer, and we will now come to the question that you preempted earlier, Malala, around the gendered nature of the workforce, I guess. We talk a lot about gender stereotypes and roles when it comes to children. But if you think about the workforce, as you said, Malala, largely women who are working in early childhood, and an extremely low-paid profession. And it strikes me as somewhat fascinating, I guess, that a workforce that is tasked with the responsibility of enabling children to flourish, creating safe spaces for them to learn and to grow into their own identity, and challenging gender roles and stereotypes, is also sort of facing this larger scale structural sort of battle involving gender and power. As you mentioned, Malali, workforce research shows that early childhood educators are so poorly paid that many of them actually are dependent on family members or their partner for additional financial support. And that, of course, brings us back to the drivers of violence against women, for example, limits to women's independence and decision making. So in sort of hovering in this theoretical space for just a little bit longer, Malali, and anyone on the panel actually, how can prevention practitioners partner with early years services and educators to contribute to overcoming these structural gender inequalities that exist for these essential and dedicated workforce?
Yeah, look, I don't have a very long answer to that one. I think the first step is to build relationships with early childhood educators, early childhood professionals, and find out what would be supportive in terms of the advocacy and lobbying that's already happening in the sector. And I think that's the opportunity for prevention practitioners to go, wow, well, what are you already doing and what's really important to you, and how does that interact, which is part of what Tanil talked about earlier on a practice level with the frameworks, the two frameworks, the prevention framework and the early years frameworks, and then this is just taking it to that next level, I think, to say, okay, well, what are the things that align in what we're all doing and how can we work together?
Does anyone else want to add anything to that?
I think one of the challenges is the way that early childhood is structured into different services. So you will have standalone services that are a childcare centre that's for profit, owned by an owner or a family that have their that has their own idea about how they want to run their centre and the things that are important to them. You can have places that are cluster managed, and so you know, there's different levels of management. So the people who are actually teaching might not have a lot of say in the pedagogy that's coming down to them, so they're more hierarchical. And you've also got ones that are under the umbrella of councils as well. So to give people access, to give educators access to professional development, you know, there's a financial cost to that, because if you are working at a place that doesn't necessarily value this kind of work, their dollars, that they're limited dollars usually, that they've got to spend on professional development might not go in this direction, depending on who's making the decisions. So you can have a centre that is a service that's really interested in changing the dynamics of power and breaking down these gender stereotypes, but unless they have, unless you can give these people, especially the ones at the bottom with the Cert 3s and the diplomas, who aren't earning the money, access to the professional development, which can be very expensive, and being able to go to conferences, then that's going to hold them back from moving into this, looking at things with the with breaking down gender bias. So Tanil, with the Darebin resource that they've made, is fantastic because it's free. So as many resources as there are like that is fantastic, and I've been lucky enough to do some professional development through Darebin that I've been able to come back and filter through to the people that I work with. So the more access there is to high quality professional development that's free, and getting it out there so that people know where and how to access it is really important as well.
Absolutely. Tanil, you look like you wanted to say something. You need a microphone, don't you?
So I think, like, leaning on from what Malali was saying, there's certainly responsibility, I think, from all tiers of government to advocate on behalf of the early years educators and the sector for the work that they're doing and to be paid fairly and equitably. And I think in the short term, until that happens, I was thinking about and Rachel led into it, you know, the other practical supports and maybe even responsibilities that organisations like local government can play a role in, which is providing the types of resources and support that meet the needs of the educators as well as councils. So things like offering a range of different training opportunities that aren't just a full day you know, workshop that requires the centre to release an educator and backfill the educator, but thinking about more creative ways, like a panel discussion where you hear things from key people about their experiences and knowledge, but also I think, you know, in creating resources so that people can apply them to their own setting with their own knowledge and skills, and I think that also respects what the educators take with them. And I think as well, you know, around challenging the other drivers of violence, that whilst it is predominantly the rigid gender stereotypes that are being challenged, I think by the very opportunity that educators have around creating a foundation where children can think more openly and be exposed to more ideas around gender, or, you know, less rigid ideas about gender, we are seeing an increase, I think, in women's decision making and you know, ideas around women. There's role modelling that takes place, whether they're male, female, other educators that are creating new ideas and ways of thinking for children that I think longer term with culture change, it will also have an outcome which is that will improve women's decision making and independence, because it won't see women as passive. You know, it's not just the stereotypes. I think it has a bigger impact that will impact on structures too. It's just not immediate, unfortunately.
It takes time, doesn't it? So much time, this cultural change. Thank you, everyone. Rachel, I want to come back to you, and you did mention some of this earlier, but I'm wondering if you might be able to elaborate. When we talk about early childhood, we're really talking about the ages from birth to 5 years or until entering primary school. The ways in which education happens with young children is, of course, very different to the way that it happens with primary school age children and particularly teenagers, of course. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rachel, the bulk of learning in the early years is done through educational play. Right. Can you share with us some of the ways that you've used play and other strategies with young children to do gender equity or violence prevention education, if you have any other sort of concrete examples other than the ones that you've mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that you structure your room is really important. So you're putting on your reflective hat and you're thinking about, how am I going to make this space equitable? And if I set it up traditionally with a home corner with cooking things over here and a block corner with cars over here, who am I giving power to and who am I expecting to use that space? So using some of the tools from Tennille's project, you can get, what I've done is actually looked at who uses the space, for how long, what spaces, no-go zones for anyone that they don't feel comfortable going into, because they don't want to be seen as, areas are seen as feminine or masculine. So some of the traditional things are bikes. So boys will often dominate the bikes and use them in quite a different way. So if you don't structure it the right way, there'll be ramming and crashing and banging and racing, and you'll find that the girls won't use that space. So the first thing is to step back and have a look at your actual physical space. How is it structured? How is it set up? What can you move? What can you change to make it equitable for everyone? Looking at the actual resources, so looking at the things that you're actually putting out. So are you putting in the block play area? Do you want to put in workman clothes? Do you have pictures there of people from both genders working as truck drivers or working as construction site people? And the same thing in the traditional home corner. Do you have a pink playset in there? Are the baby dolls and dolls' clothes gendered as well? So you have to really look at every aspect of what you're doing. Books is a really interesting one, because a lot of childcare centres will have books that are donated from families and also resources. And on doing a book audit, I was quite horrified at some of the ones that had slipped under the radar. So you don't have to throw them out, you don't have to burn books. You can use the books that you find as a point of discussion. So with a book audit I did with my kindergarten class, we went through some of the books that had been back in the storeroom. So not our go-to goodies. And we found Cooking for Girls. Lovely pink cover with love hearts all over it. And instead of just, relegating that to the rubbish bin, it was a discussion point. So why are these recipes for girls? So we looked at each recipe and, do you think this recipe sounds yum? Gingerbread, who thinks that's nice? So you don't have to strip everything out and hide it all away without the children there and it be passive. You can actually use the things that you've come across that might have surprised you about how you've gendered your classroom accidentally as discussion points. One of the things that we found was we were using a really fun set of videos from the internet, they're from Netflix, we were looking at them on YouTube, called Storybots. And they're little songs about dinosaurs, or little songs about counting, or little songs about space. And they're very cute little robots, and they're very, very catchy little tunes. And we were looking at it, and I discovered that you could actually sign up to it, and that in the States it's very big. And teachers use it a lot in their classrooms. So you can actually sign up, and you get access to more of the site. So looking at that, we looked at the contents page. And the contents page had a list of characters. And we found that the list of characters was really gendered. So one of the characters was a female robot. I don't know why you need to have male or female robots, but she was pink and she had lovely eyelashes. And her description, so her bio, said that Rose was a sweet and silly storybot. And she made the two male robot characters swoon for her. So this led to a discussion about what swoon meant. Now, it was just so inappropriate because these particular videos, they're targeted at young children, so maybe sort of 3 to 8 year olds. They don't need to be thinking that characters need to be swooned over. So with a bit of student-led activism, we emailed Storybots in America and got a response straight away, which was fantastic. And they acknowledged it and they changed it. So Rose became a smart and sassy storybot who matched wits with the 2 male storybots. So it was just a way of, instead of ignoring it or instead of, it's a bad thing, actually saying, well, if you don't like it, you can do something about it. And the children felt really empowered about that. And after that, it was a real turning point because after that, kids were coming in and saying, oh, well, I was in Target and there was a sequined jumper that I really wanted. And you know what, I just got it. And I might have been with Dad and he said no. And I said, that's just silly, you've been tricked by the people who sell advertising. So the great thing is that it might seem like a small thing or it might seem like a small conversation that you're having, but if you're having it enough, children are so smart, they're so capable, and it's the same for them. Once they have their gender lens on, they don't take it off either. And if there's one thing that children like, it's fairness. Yeah, have you ever played a game with a 4-year-old? They like fairness. So once you've switched that on for them, they will come up to you with their own examples. And so after the fire station where we had earlier on in the year where we had children who were saying, firemen, we later on that year set up the hospital. And it was really interesting because we didn't have the same problem. It was okay to have a female doctor, and it was fine to have a male nurse. And if anyone did try and, say that they couldn't, they were shut down pretty quickly by their own peer group, which was fantastic. So viewing children as capable and competent is really important.
Fantastic, so inspiring, and of course it reminds us, I think, that we got to where we are today and even having these conversations largely through activism over many, many decades, and particularly the activism of many, many women, but also people of a range of genders. And so bringing that into the classroom at such a young age, I think is really powerful, and the sense of pride and achievement that they must have got from that would have been fantastic. We're going to sort of expand on that a little bit now. And Sophie, I'm wondering if you'd like to comment on this, this next one initially. There's been a great deal of media hype, as we're all very well aware, around the notion of social engineering when it comes to bringing the concept and experience of gender into classrooms. Fears, for example, that early years educators are going to be forcing even boys to wear dresses and girls to play with tools and machinery, for example. And these sorts of fear-mongering claims can sometimes make educators quite nervous and anxious, I guess, understandably, about doing respectful relationships education work. For those that do want to do it though, what sorts of supports, structural or otherwise, do you think they might need in order to feel safe and prepared and confident to do this work?
I would actually add that it doesn't just make educators nervous, it makes centre managers nervous, it makes all different levels, depending on what your children's services setting is located within. So
and right through to politicians, obviously, making big decisions around these issues. Yeah.
And that can sort of fall down. You can have an article in the Herald Sun, and then it's just this cascade, and you can just almost watch it happening before your eyes. I think things like the Vic Health resource that's just been released, which is how to manage backlash. I really hope that I've had a look at it. I really hope that gets legs. I really hope that can be translated by many different people who are working in many different areas who are trying to do this work, and it gets translated, properly. Because I think a lot of the time it is fear that stops us from doing things, but it's also because we don't have the skills or the knowledge of how to counter that fear. So we don't know how to do it, so we don't do it. And it's almost like we need that set of extra skills to open up that door of opportunity to say, well, this is how I can counter that argument. I think a lot of the fear that I guess that we experienced in our pilot was, well, not fear, but reticence, I suppose, was that some of the educators felt like they didn't really know how to talk to the parents about this, and they felt very exposed. And so I think one of the really, really important things to do is to focus very clearly on how you are going to skill up and support and mentor educators so they can have conversations with parents. And that's where Our Watch comes in with a beautiful new resource. That's long-term work, that takes a long time, and you need to go through, the educators need to get a lot of training and skill development under their belt before they can even go out and talk to parents. So it's a long-term kind of commitment. I just see this in a kind of, I think you've got to step back and get perspective on it. We're talking about cultural change here. It's been going on for many years in different guises, led by various different movements. It was only 10 or 15 years ago that Vic Health kind of stepped into this space and started talking about health consequences to violence. That changed things up slightly, and people started to get a lot more interested from different areas, or the financial costs of violence. That triggered some more interest. And I think, we have to acknowledge that educators are in quite a difficult position. They're doing all kinds of things apart from this. And really, if you were going to sort of go out tomorrow and want to support educators in a program, making sure that the organisation that is housing the program or housing the approach is fully committed to that approach, there's actually no point in doing this unless that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Rachel, as an early years educator, a kindergarten educator, is there anything that you would like to add to that question in terms of nervousness or experiencing resistance?
Look, I've not had too many negative experiences myself.
That's good.
When it has happened, it's been, it's often a father who has not been pleased about a son wearing dress-ups. Dress-ups are just such a hot point. There is something so threatening to some people about a little boy wearing a skirt. And that's something that, you know, the media has done a bit of a beat up about. So I would never not allow a child to not wear a dress up of their choosing. So I have had conversations with people before. I have had parents who've said, "Oh, look, I don't want him doing that," and I have had to counter that with saying, "I'm not the dress up police. That's not my role," and it's not appropriate either. And that is a really difficult thing to do as an early childhood educator, because you are going to be working with those parents for a long time, at least all year, and then if it is a childcare centre, you might be working with them over the course of several years. And it is something that you have to do. It is something that if you really are sticking with children's rights, and if you're really thinking about the frameworks, which identity is a big part of it, and supporting children's emerging identity, you are not going to stand at the dress-up corner and tell children they can or cannot wear certain things. But it is really scary, and that's just one-on-one conversation with someone. So in that situation, it's often something that you might need some support for. So you might go to your centre director, or you might even ask further afield for even working on a little template of what you're going to say, or even finding some research that supports what you want to say, and having that with you and being prepared. But it's not terribly common. I've been lucky, but it certainly does happen.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I guess sort of building on that, I'm wondering, Malali, if we can come back to you now and hear a little bit from you about what you think are the key things that the community sector really needs to know about the early childhood context before seeking to work or partner with them. And I think that Rachel's just sort of started touching on some of this and the others as well. Do you want to build on that?
So I think we have touched on the fact that it's a sector without the more structured systems and resourcing of other educational settings, such as primary schools and secondary schools. It's made up of very small businesses, which is a family daycare operator in their home, small and medium-sized businesses, and large corporations. So when you're talking about working in the sector, you're potentially talking about working across or within any number of those types of businesses and business models, which also range from the very large not-for-profit, sometimes which companies are floated on the stock exchange, to the very small community-owned, managed and run, to also non-government, and also government services as well. So the first thing is just to know that is the scope of, when you say early childhood education and care, that's what you're talking about. And I guess just to be clear then about when you're working or where you want to do work, or work out where you do want to do work before, and it might be everywhere, but it's good to think about how you then do that, how you get into the larger corporations, and how you speak to different groups, and how you ensure work that you're doing is relevant to different groups. I think it's worth noting that it does operate within a market model. So parents and families where there's enough services can choose to leave a service if they're unhappy about things, or go to a service if they're happy about things, if they're happier with the way practices are running in another service, conversely. And that there is some specific Australian research to build work in this area that brings early childhood academics such as Dr. Kylie Smith, and even previously to her work and have looked at feminist theory and early childhood theory together, that there is a history of ongoing professional development and critical reflection within the sector. And there is a body of research about transformational professional development and participatory approaches to professional development. And there's Australian research in those areas. So there is a body of work that's been led by early childhood academics and trialled in different jurisdictions across Australia that can inform work that we do, I think is probably the main thing.
Thank you. Does anyone want to build on that or contribute anything else?
I was just going to say on the idea around professional development and supporting educators in their professional development, that wouldn't it be fantastic if we could actually get respectful relationships and gender equity embedded in a Cert 3 early education course, diploma, degrees, whatever it is, and then you're really starting right back from the core learning outcomes that are needed, and obviously that would be great. That's your real kind of primary. That's primary prevention stuff, isn't it? Really, it's going back to
service space,
giving everybody in the workforce that opportunity to do that. I was just going to add that I really believe, and I think I've said this before, but I really think that one of the most important things is to work with the willing.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, Malali, children's, early years services provided to the fives and under, comes in many, many different guises, and there will be some organisations who either can't at this moment get involved because of the way they're run, or don't want to. And I think it's really about identifying, if you're a community organisation wanting to do this work, identifying the services, possibly through maybe an EOI process. I know, Daisy, you've been doing that with your project. I think it's a really great approach to get people who are wanting to dip their toe in at a management level and also an educator level. So that's the kind of basis, I think, the starting point. Yeah.
Great. Tennille, we'll come to you now, and I guess this is an expansion of what we've just been talking about, but I'm wondering if you could comment on what you see as some of the key opportunities or possibilities for the community sector and local government, which you have spoken about already, to partner with early child services to embed respectful relationships education.
So I guess it is finding those willing, curious, I think early years services that want to do this work, but I think also that it's those maybe that are doing it that need a little bit of extra support. So like what I said before, I think whether you're a local government or a community health centre or any kind of, I guess, community organisation that are trying to support the implementation of respectful relationships, I think it's about recognising or asking the questions around the kinds of support that an early years centre or educator needs. I think I can't repeat it enough that there are so many wonderful early years educators that are thinking about these things and having really reflective conversations with children about gender stereotypes or about how not cool it is that a storybot has all of these gendered ideas placed on them, and that stuff is happening. And so I think if we can try and find a way to support the early years to do the bits of work that are hard for them in amongst their structures and in amongst maybe the sector and how it is shaped and exists, that's really a way. And I think from a local government experience, something that has really helped local governments become, I guess, or do more in the preventing violence against women space has been things around like foundational policies such as a family violence workplace policy. And I know that Malali touched on that too, around when you have these kind of platforms or these foundations that make it really clear about what the organisation will tolerate, won't tolerate, will support, and recognises the profound impact on this. Often this foundation or, a foundation to do work on the other end of the continuum continuum of violence as well. And so maybe that's not the most, maybe that's not the point that's in the front of the mind of an early years educator, but that's potentially the point of really, influence that a community organisation can have and support to do. There are so many template policies out there that can support a centre. And I think, if there are these challenging points where parents are feeling uncomfortable, I think one of the things I didn't say before, but I was thinking, is that my experience as a Preventing Violence Against Women practitioner is that as a general, I think, idea, we can agree that most people don't condone men's violence against women, but when we start to ask people about how they feel about gender and gender equity, people get really uncomfortable. So I think one of the reasons why there's this discomfort is maybe from community or from families is because we're talking about gender. We're not talking about violence anymore at that end of the continuum. So I think when you do have those policies that really pull you back to the point of this is why we're doing it, it's not only to end men's violence against women, it's so that everyone lives a fair and just life and their human rights. But I just think it's finding that point of how best to support. And I think as a community organisation, you've got to be flexible. You've got to want to work with them through a whole of centre approach, and you might only come in for a piece of that, but finding what suits them.
Fantastic.
I derailed, sorry.
No, not at all. It's spot on, and it's the crux of it, I think, is about asking the question rather than making assumptions. And I think what you said at the end there, Tennille, about people becoming, saying, of course we don't condone men's violence against women, but then becoming very uncomfortable and sometimes really resisting conversations around gender. And that reminds me of what you said earlier, Mulayli, about the research that you conducted, where I think you said 92% of Australians think that girls and boys should be treated equally. Is that what it was?
It was 92% of the parents surveyed
right.
in the piece of research that we did.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But if you were to speak to those parents about gender identity and some of the examples that Rachel's given, I imagine it would be quite a different story. That on one hand they might say, yes, of course we believe in this, and on the other hand they might be saying, there's no way I'm going to let my little boy wear a dress. So making the links, joining the dots is tricky for people, I think. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, and we did ask, not necessarily that question, but our research reports does ask parents to convey their comfortability with if they had a child, sort of ask fathers their comfortability with certain things in relation to their male child and their female child, and ask mothers their comfortability with certain things in relation to their male child or female child, and we were able to compare some of those responses, which brings out some of that contradiction sometimes. Like, the research did find some contradictions, and I guess it was on that basis that we developed the campaign to go, you know what, parents don't want their children to be limited, so this is actually about letting kids be kids. If that's what this is actually about, and that's how we positioned, that's how we wrote the campaign in a lot of ways, and it's been quite successful in terms of visits and getting out there into the world without too much backlash.
Fantastic, and we can provide links to those as well afterwards. I've got one last question for the panel, and then I'm going to hand over to you for audience Q&A. But before we do, I'm just wondering if you can each share with us one, and I know it can be hard to think of one, but one key thing that you would like to see happen in the space of early years education and respectful relationships in the next 12 months. So something sort of achievable or tangible that you'd like to see. Tennille, we'll start with you. Or with anyone who's ready to answer the question.
I guess I would like to see more of, a clearer understanding by lots of, tiers of government and different organisations about how the frameworks in the early years and the framework in gender equality do work together, but that there are still a lot of opportunities to strengthen that. And I think one of the reasons why that would be so helpful is because the preventing violence against women sector might be relatively new to this space, but the early years aren't. And so I think that when those two areas of quite incredible evidence base and the frameworks could come together, I feel like we could see a huge kind of, I don't know, increase in how early years centres are supported. I guess maybe that won't happen in the 12 months, but I think maybe a clearer acknowledgement of the frameworks working together.
Fantastic. Thanks, Danielle. What about you, Sophie?
I'm not sure if it's achievable either. But really sort of following on from what Danielle said, I suppose we're operating in an environment in Victoria in particular where there's quite a large degree of uncertainty around, state government support or the ability, what's going to happen. It's an election year, and I know, there's a bit of nervousness about that and what that means for the work and how it will continue. And while that's very real, what I would really love to see is a bit more of a kind of grassroots, bottom-up movement. I think it's already there, but possibly to strengthen that movement so that if there is a change in government and things do change, because we don't know either of those things, but if that does happen, that we're, as a sector, being able to move forward with the work anyway. I know that this work was started, a long time ago, and there was some real progress made around the early 90s or the late 80s, early 90s. A lot of the work of people like Glenda McNaughton. And then it sort of didn't have the support that it needed for, political reasons. And it, I'm sure there were still educators in the sector doing the work, but it just didn't get the legs, it just didn't get the buy-in and the support and the publicity. So yeah, I guess I'd really like to see more of a grassroots movement coming up and having a voice. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sophie. Rachel?
I'd like to see early childhood educators and services accessing the great resources that are already around and having some training around them too, so they're not just sitting there at home looking at it going, where do I start? Yeah. And I'd like to see educators just dipping their toe and taking that first step and finding that it's actually easier than you think. And I'd like to see the confidence grow, especially in the educators who don't have university qualifications. So in a typical service or a typical childcare centre, only the kindergarten teacher will have a degree usually, and the rest of the staff of a service will have a diploma or a Cert 3. So empowering them to also take up this work, that you don't need to have a university degree and have studied papers in gender to be able to just start, and that starting is the first step.
So important, thank you. And Malali?
Yeah, look, Tennille stole a bit of my thunder, but I'm gonna wing it in this case because I've just had some thoughts during today. Look, I think what I was going to say is to embrace the opportunity to work together and combine the practice wisdom that people, practitioners and early childhood education and care professionals bring, which was similar to what Tennille was saying. I guess something that sort of clicked for me just during this conversation and going back to Sophie's idea of the gender pedagogue, was that? No, the idea from your report and your research. Look, while we're working towards that, why not use the prevention sector and the early childhood sector in that way? The prevention sector can bring the gender, the early childhood sector can potentially bring the pedagogue and the pedagogy. And some people will be able to bring both. But what I'd like to see is some really clear, I think the challenge is finding these individual advocates within these large and small organisations, which I think is what we've been talking about. And the other one is resourcing. So how do we think about resourcing the work we can do, bringing those two areas together? And I think I'd like to see some solutions to resourcing that don't always rely on an organisational resource, but allow an individual educator who's interested in doing work in this way to access some resource that's practical and useful and helps them do the work despite, regardless of the context in which they're trying to do the work in some ways. So I think that's what I'd like to see.
Fantastic, great. Okay, over to you for questions. We'll start with someone in the room if there are any questions here. And Louise, do we have any questions coming through on the live stream? We do have a question. Excellent. Anyone here though today that's physically in the room who has a question? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I work for the government, but I work as a preschool officer, but I work with families a lot. And I have a real issue when, when I organise a meeting with a family and only the dad comes. And you have to get an interpreter as well because a lot of the families don't speak English. So then I ask the mum if the mum could come, but the fathers will only come to the meetings. So it's really quite a difficult situation when and the mums don't come anywhere near the centres or at all, and the fathers tend to take control. So it's really tricky because you want the parent to come because you've got to do all this stuff with the children to get assessments and so on. But I don't know how to address it when the fathers just won't let the mums come to the meetings, if you know what I mean. Yep.
Right, so it's a dynamic where the fathers essentially aren't letting the mothers come along to those meetings. Yeah. Does anyone on the panel have any comments or anything you'd like to say in response to the question?
I'm not sure how helpful this will be for your experience, but my knowledge of the preschool field officer program, which is really very excellent, is also the potential relationship with the centre or the the service in which the child is also enrolled in, because I guess that's how the referral comes to you in the first place. And I wonder about the potential of the centre supporting you or you supporting the centre to also be having a conversation with the parents as they collect the child, because that is a challenge, and I'm certain that would be for a lot of early years services in both the example you gave but also the reverse, when it's only one of the parents coming along and wanting to even promote some positive gender norms to the family. But I guess maybe as well thinking about how the centre or the service might be able to work with you directly and the family.
It's usually around family violence. Usually there's family violence in the family.
Yeah, I wondered.
So usually there's some issues with violence in the home, and so the mum just doesn't come. It's not about that issue. It's about the issue of violence usually. Yeah.
I mean, that's very challenging, and I know that a number of centres do have information about family violence resources, but I mean, if you're speaking to a parent who might be the perpetrator of family violence, that's a really challenging position to be in, and I don't know that I have a response to that, sorry.
It is a really, it is a very tricky situation, and the only thing I think I would add to what Tennealle has said is to engage, if you haven't already, and you probably have, with the local family violence service provider or service providers around what you're noticing and what you think might be going on in some of those homes, and seeking advice from them about the least risky and safest kind of ways to work with the women in those situations, and sometimes thinking outside the square, as Tennealle has alluded, in terms of how you might actually gain safe access to those women, to let them know a little bit about the options that they might have if they're interested in hearing some of those. But it is a very tricky situation, and we certainly don't want to ever do anything that would in any way escalate her risk. And so engaging with and talking with local family violence service providers would be the first step. Yeah. Yes.
Hello there. Thank you, everyone. It was really engaging and fantastic topic. I just wanted to pick up on that point because I think cultural sensitivities are very much a big part of this conversation in the early years space. And I think I work in the northern suburbs, Glenroy, Faulkner, around there. So having these conversations with families in particular is often very, very challenging for early years practitioners. And I think that's a conversation that needs to be started as well, about the cultural sensitivities and the issues around gender norms and family violence. And I think it's worth unpacking those conversations first before we get into kind of looking at helping children with non-gendered kind of roles within our society as well. So that's just a comment, and that's coming from experience as a kinder teacher. The other thing that I just wanted to really quickly touch on was that it's fantastic that DET is doing the respectful relationships training, but it struck a chord with me just sitting here that we've got, as community organisations, a really big part to play in this, because that respectful relationships training is only being rolled out to kindergarten teachers. There's a whole massive part of the sector in terms of in long daycare centres, family daycare, that's not being rolled out to. So family daycare, long daycare, there's a massive amount of the workforce that work in those services that won't benefit from these conversations. So I think that we could be doing a lot in that space. So I work for a local government in Moreland, and I think that we've got some work to do, which I'm really seriously excited about.
Fantastic. Thank you for those comments. Over here, Lou.
Hi, thanks. I also work in local government coordinating playgroups, and I'd just like to add to Sarah's comment that it'd be great to roll it out to supported playgroups as well. We're actually in a position where we're actually talking with the parents each week, and we've got a really good opportunity to establish those relationships with parents as well as working with children, so that would be a good outcome as well.
Thank you. Yeah, please, Sophie.
Thanks. I was just going to say, with the pilot that we've run and evaluated, and the learnings and recommendations that have come out, part of that pilot we developed, we co-designed with children and parents and educators some resources and tools, so more resources and tools, and we're hoping to do some work with DVRCV around this as well and promote this. But we're really hoping to be able to adapt a lot of those tools and resources so that other non-traditional childcare settings can use them, like supported playgroups and, in libraries where there are children's programs for libraries, recreation centres, and obviously I'm at a council as well, so we're really wanting to look at all the different touch points where we come into contact with families and parents and children, so that we can take the learnings from our project and adapt them to those settings. So,
thanks, Sophie. Louise, what's the question we've got coming through online?
Yep, so this question's from Angela, who's online, and it's specifically for Sophie about the City of Melbourne project. She was just wanting to know whether early childhood services were offered any kind of incentive, financial or otherwise, to take part in that project.
No, they weren't. It's the short answer. The pilot was run in a council-run service, so it's sort of, I suppose it wouldn't have been appropriate anyway, because it's sort of part of our own organisation. We did have a discussion about how to kind of incentivise participation, and that was around the fact that even the educators had to opt into being part of the program and the evaluation because of the ethics approval process with the research done. Ordinarily, if you didn't have that, you could probably run a pilot and stipulate that all the educators need to be involved to the level that they can be. So I don't know, but we did sort of think about it in terms of the parents, but it seemed a bit like bribery. So yeah, we thought ethically it wasn't appropriate to do that.
Any other questions or comments? Nothing more online, Louise? No? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much again for being here today. Thank you to those of you that have tuned in online. And please join me in thanking our panel, Tennille, Sophie, Rachel and Malali, for their wonderful contributions today. Just before we do break to have some lunch together, sorry to those online, there's no lunch here for you today. I just wanted to ask you if you can please fill out the feedback form that's on the back of your agenda for today. We're in the process at the moment of going into the evaluation stage of the current funding period for PIP, and as many of you will know, we take your feedback very seriously, and it really is your feedback at all of the events and opportunities that we put on that guides us in the future direction of the work that we do with and for you. So please do take some time to fill that out. There's an additional question on today's form at the bottom, which just gives you an opportunity to list any topics that you would like to see discussed in future seminar series that we might hold. Thank you all once again, and hopefully we'll see you at the prevention conference on the 29th of May. Louise has got some pens for anyone who doesn't have a pen to fill out their feedback form, and if you can just leave the feedback forms on your seat or at the table at the back. We've got some catering, so feel free to stay around for the next half